Space Center for letting me join you tonight. It's really a great pleasure and honor to join you. We might be able to do this kind of thing in person again. Thanks also to Alistair for his help just now with my PowerPoint. And of course, to the audience for tuning in on a Friday evening and for your patience already for waiting for the PowerPoint to work. So I get to be the Wölflinian art historian tonight who says next, because I haven't got my PowerPoint to work on my computer. With this, Alistair, can we have the first slide?
Just loading it up now.
Okay.
Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, I can see it. I won't be able to point to it with my cursor,
yeah.
But that's okay. I'll
that's
describe
right.
it. Maybe you want to go to a slideshow?
Yeah, I'll start. And can our guests see that? Is everyone getting that?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. Okay.
Okay, fantastic. I'll just say next. Sorry for the patronizing comment, but it seems like we're out of options. So I wanted to use this invitation as an opportunity to present work very much in progress from the book manuscript that I'm trying to finish at the moment. The book is titled Imperial Data in Architectural History, and it's a historical ontology of the epistemic regime that we call a database today. I look at 19th century storehouses of information in an attempt to understand how the history of this particular arrangement came into being. So these storehouses can be thought of proto-databases, but ones that preceded computational technologies of the 20th century. I initially started this project with examples from both sides of the Atlantic, but for reasons that I hope will become clear in the course of the talk, I decided to focus on the British Empire in the second half of the 19th century instead. So from the moment laissez-faire policies are adopted, though the imperial reach of these proto-datas does not really come into focus until the next chapter of the book, which is on the Kew Herbarium. This, however, is entirely new territory for me, so I'm kind of intimidated, I have to admit, and at the same time very excited to get feedback from those who know a lot more, especially from Mark Crinton, who has written so brilliantly on this period. So next. So let me begin with this blank chart, one that I had to reverse engineer from completed ones that are now in the collections of the British Geological Survey. On September 23rd, 1841, when Thomas Sopwith, mining engineer and mineral surveyor, lectured at the Yorkshire Geological Society, he began by showing his audience a blank chart that must have looked like this. 15 inches by 20 inches and engraved with a grid that represented a scale of 40 feet to an inch, the chart had been printed by the Museum of Economic Geology in London for the purpose of recording geological sections. But Sopwith hoped that it might be standardized and distributed more widely. Next. This was crucial, he argued, as railway cuttings were increasingly becoming a common sight, giving British geologists, amateur and professional alike, unprecedented opportunities to observe dramatic geological sections. By this point, of course, the construction of railways and the expansion of the mining industry had become mutually reinforcing phenomena in Britain, generating enormous economic growth with reverberations around the globe. Next. If early rail cars were constructed to carry freight out of coal fields, the steam engines that now pulled them were powered by the same coal. Sopwith was convinced that even more growth could be achieved simply by gathering the information revealed by mining and railway construction. Next. But it was imperative that this information be collected methodically, that is, using the same scale and the same color scheme and on standardized pieces of paper as illustrated by this section that you're seeing here from 1857. If this information could be collected at a large enough scale, preserved by the government in a registry dedicated to mineral statistics, and made available to any British entrepreneur interested in agriculture, mining, or railway construction, there was no limit, Sopwith argued, to the future prosperity of the kingdom. Next. The blank charts that Sopwith flaunted was not only printed, but also filled out dozens of times, and here you can click 3 times, in the Mining Records Office of the Museum of Economic Geology in London. Compiled from various sources, these charts use an abstract visual language, and usually without color, to show Earth's strata in unusually long columnar sections that allow the geologist to compare several locations on one piece of paper. Next, for a detail of a later one. Oh, actually one more. Columnar sections visually restore disturbances such as folding or faulting of strata into perfectly horizontal layers. Hatching and shading were used to indicate changes in mineralogical composition. Geological sections were relatively rare until the 1820s. Columnar sections even more so. Next, please. Geological data collecting started earlier in the century with plans and especially with the coloring of ordnance maps. Henry de la Beche, the founder and the first director of the Museum of Economic Geology, started his career in the 1820s as a gentleman geologist coloring ordnance maps of Pembrokeshire. Next. Before embarking upon a geological survey of the eastern half of Jamaica, when he visited it in the hopes of preventing his family's sugar plantation from going bankrupt. And note that what he produced ultimately in Jamaica were also colored plans. Next. By 1835, de la Beche was able to convince the Geological Society of London that it was crucial to set up a geological survey that was dependent on, but distinct from, the trigonometrical survey supervised by the Board of Ordnance. In a report also published in 1835, the Society noted that such a systematic geological survey would offer countless economic advantages. Mineral statistics thereby collected would help find coal and precious metals, detect new water sources, construct canals, railroads, and tunnels, and identify chemicals crucial to the artificial improvement of soil. De la Beche was given makeshift apartments in Charing Cross from which he could run the geological survey, but his office soon started venturing beyond ordnance maps. Next. Even before the founding of the Geological Survey in 1835, de la Beche drew sections, albeit rarely of the columnar kind that Sopwith promoted, so this is kind of an unusual one. The newly founded museum soon started assembling a proto-database of geological information that consisted of plans and sections, in addition to collecting mineral specimens that were unearthed during surveys and railway construction or donated by enthusiasts. Starting in 1839, the geological sections that Sopwith promoted would be housed in a department of the museum, the Mining Records Office. Next. In 1851, the museum, now consisting of the Government School of Mines, as well as the Mining Records Office and the Geological Survey, moved from the apartments in Charing Cross to a custom-designed building in a narrow infill site between two busy streets, Piccadilly and German, near Piccadilly Circus. The building was demolished in 1933 after the collections had already been moved. And I should also add here that a few years after the move, the name of the institution was changed to the Museum of Practical as opposed to Economic Geology, although the old name continued to be used, and throughout this talk I'll use the old name. One of the many public projects realized in London during the expansion of British bureaucracy in the 19th century, the building was designed by the architect James Pennethorne for the Office of Works with advice from de la Beige. Next. And here are very quickly some early versions of the design, which differed from the final constructed version. Next. The building had an elaborate section. The 400-person auditorium in the basement had a glass ceiling that took advantage of the light admitted by an iron and glass roof that covered over the open spaces of the main galleries, which unfortunately I can't show with my cursor, but it's in the middle, right in the middle of the building, and the ceiling was 43 feet at its tallest point. And the laboratories and offices, including those holding the mining records, were situated right behind the facades facing the streets. Maybe if we look at the next slide, which is a plan, which is basically the offices and the laboratories were in the leftover spaces in the plan, leftover from the figure of the horseshoe plan of the theater that you see in the middle. The auditorium's horseshoe plan, next, also determined, as you will see in a second, the spatial arrangement of the galleries above. It was above all in the main galleries that Sopwith and de la Beige's sectional thinking was demonstrated. The display cases around the horseshoe opening were arranged in strata, as if they formed a geological section of their own. The building got so much attention in the press, this despite the competition from the Crystal Palace Great Exhibition, that by 1853 other cities were campaigning to open their own geological museums. Historians who have written on the museum have focused on the pedagogical role played by the building's galleries, calling attention to contemporaneous discourses that would characterize a visit to such a museum as rational entertainment or rational recreation, as opposed to more lowbrow pastime activities. This was not only for the purposes of refining the tastes and improving the habits and manners of those who subsist by the sweat of the brow, as one contemporary put it. On the occasion of a library opening in 1841, the Conservative Prime Minister Robert Peel, who would spearhead the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, described such rational recreation as having to do with an economic sensibility. Now, the next slide with the quote, which I will start reading. He said, "Do not believe that you have not time," that is what you will hear, "for rational recreation. It's the idle man who wants time for everything. The industrious man, the man who is persevering in his pursuits, is the man who knows the value of the economy of time and can find leisure for rational recreation as well for his attention to his business. Do not believe that the acquisition of knowledge is inconsistent with the success of your worldly pursuits. Depend upon it. You cannot exercise and sharpen your intellectual faculties in one branch of knowledge without becoming better men of business and consequence." The connection that Peel's address makes here between knowledge of the applied kind, the kind offered by the Museum of Practical Geology, and the economy has been thoroughly naturalized since then. Think, for example, of the term information economy, referring to a stage of capitalism in which buying and selling of information becomes the primary activity in an advanced economy, replacing manufacturing and so on. Next. What I'd like to do in this talk is to examine the Museum of Economic Geology in an attempt to understand how that connection was forged in a particular manner in the 19th century. How did the building function as what we would today call a database or an information environment? In what ways did it offer rational entertainment? What kind of rationality was this? My argument will be that the architecture of the building, especially its sectional logic, had something to do with teaching the public about this connection between knowledge and the economy. For this, I will return again to sections. Can I have the next one? Now, by 1820s, it had been firmly established that Earth had a stratified structure and that those strata were not uniform, but rather rose, sunk, broke, tore, folded, and extruded, which made geological observation tricky. Even as de Lebesgue acknowledged the difficulties that these normally invisible structures presented, he considered sectional thinking crucial to geological observation. Next. Some geological sections were natural, such as those afforded by some sea cliffs, he explained, while others were artificial, such as those discussed by Sopwith, the railway cutting. But the ones crucial to the serious geologists were ideal sections. He called these annex sections, such as the bottom figure that you see here marked with figure 16. Such sections did not illustrate direct observation, which might be a granite outcrop here, a depression revealing sandy soil there, and so on, but rather synthesized observed data into coherent diagrams, so that strata did not confusingly blend into each other. Rather, they were clearly separated into zones and marked with letters and numerals for pedagogical effect. Next. Most of the illustrations in his books, in fact, were such annex sections, some of which employed color as well, as you see here. Next. The columnar section took the annex section one step further by flattening disturbances in strata so that geological structures could be compared side by side. Next. Sopwith, for his part, created three-dimensional versions of the annex section. Having inherited a cabinetry manufactory in Newcastle upon Tyne, he produced elaborately constructed models out of wood, models whose vertical dimensions were exaggerated and whose strata marked with paint or different kinds of wood. These models could frequently be taken apart and examined in section. Sopwith supplied both instructional models of ideal sections to the Government School of Mines. This is what you see in those two bottom images there, and models of real regions and mines, what you see in the top image, to the Museum of Economic Geology. Next. I therefore want to suggest that we should understand the spatial arrangement of the main galleries of the museum as an oversized annexed section, one stretched out to the size of a building for the purposes of training the public in geological knowledge. Like de Lebesgue's drawings and Sopwith's models, its stratigraphic organization was purposefully exaggerated and annotated for purposes of instruction. Next. Let me quickly go through the organization of the galleries. It will be hard without a cursor, but and these are, I should say, incomplete plans from guidebooks. Still trying to get them to produce the plans from the archives. So only the parts open to the public are shown here and marked with text and so on. And I marked the footprint of the entire building as an outline, just to give you a general idea of the overall arrangement of the building. So the first floor plan, the plan on your left, was dedicated to mineralogical and petrographical specimens. So according to a guide, the organization here was in the first place topographic and in the second place economic. This meant that British minerals, in the bottom section of that plan on both the right and the left sides, British minerals were separated from ores classified as colonial and foreign. Next. But in any one of these subdivisions, the visitor's gaze too was meant to trace the section, movement section from the specimens displayed in the vertical cases on the walls toward the horizontal cases exhibiting a range of economic products. As one observer noted in 1874, the specimens were arranged in separate lines of cases placed in such juxtaposition that the progress of any one mineral may be traced from the geological stratum whence the ore is extracted through the various processes of manufacture till the metal ultimately assumes the forms required for use or ornament. In other words, your gaze is supposed to go from raw material to finished product. Next. The British fossil exhibits in the two cantilevered galleries overlooking the first floor, these are the plans in the middle and on the right, followed a different sectional logic. Here, the display cases were organized chronologically, proceeding from Paleozoic fossils in the lower gallery to Mesozoic and Cenozoic fossils in the upper gallery. For practical reasons, however, instead of being arranged as a column, next, the displays wrapped around the two gallery levels. So the idea was that the visitor was to experience the vertical layers of earth horizontally while making one's way around the second and third floor galleries from west to east. So at a moment when the debate between uniformitarianism and catastrophism, a debate with strong theological implications about biblical time, of course, when this debate was still heated and the Devonian controversy about where coal was to be found in a geological section was only beginning to cool, it's significant that the museum's organization avoided mixing fossils considered to be stratigraphic markers with mineralogical and petrographical specimens. The result was that the specimens of minerals and fossils in the display cases were presented not as natural wonders, not as evidence of God's existence, but as markers of future economic potential. According to one account from the 1850s, what made the museum useful was that the displays were meticulously labeled with information about the sources of the specimens, which in turn were correlated to good maps, by which means a large amount of information might be condensed and rendered easy of access to all persons interested therein. As de Lebedge put during the opening ceremony of the museum, collections should be arranged with every reference to instruction so that those interested might be able to judge how far our known mineral wealth might be rendered available for any undertaking that might be required to direct and promote for the good or ornament of the country. Next. But who was meant to be the recipient of this information? The publicity material for the museum stressed that geological information was especially important to proprietors whose knowledge of the underground riches of their land was the key to unlocking the hidden potentials of the economy. Whether operating in the field of agriculture, mining, or construction, the interested entrepreneur could trace any specimen on display to the Mining Records Office, which, apart from the geological sections that I started with, held maps and models. Next, for an example of these. Oh no, actually, this is the plan. Now, from what I can tell, the Mining Records Office was initially located behind the galleries on the first floor. So the top portion of the plan there, the leftover spaces, so to speak, between the imprint of the gallery and the footprint of the building. Next. But after 1872, when the Government School of Mines separated from the museum and moved to South Kensington, these offices were relocated to the ground floor where the lecture hall once was. Here it seems to have received a public-facing map and model room past the hall dedicated to British marbles. Next. On display here were several geological models with exaggerated vertical scales, arguably also annex sections. Some were by Sopwith's manufactory, as well as geological maps. Entrepreneurs had to inquire here to see other sections, plans, and records. Next. Can I have the next one? Thank you. Robert Hunt, the first keeper, no, the one before. Robert Hunt, the first keeper of the Mining Records Office, also published detailed mineral statistics in thick volumes of almanacs, which could be consulted on site in the museum's library. Other facilities behind the exhibition galleries turned out to be just as important to entrepreneurship. Next. As the London Coal Exchange reopened in a new building in 1849, the laboratories of the Museum of Economic Geology compared the chemical composition of coal from around the world. De la Beche bragged in 1851 that it was the Museum of Economic Geology that analyzed the coal for the Admiralty to figure out the best kind suited to the British Steam Navy. Newspapers published articles on the results of the experiments carried out at the museum, how the quality of coal specimens from Patagonia, for example, compared to those from Vancouver Island or to domestic coal from Newcastle. The Museum of Economic Geology then operated as an information hub of sorts, connecting dots in a network, albeit an incomplete network, that included nodes like the coal exchange. Behind the exhibition galleries were offices that kept mineral statistics, connecting the thousands of specimens on display to sites worldwide. Even though it was never systematized as thoroughly as Sopwith had envisioned, the Mining Records Office at the museum functioned, we could say, as a proto-database of sorts. Next. This, after all, was why Sopwith thought mineral statistics were so important. Subterranean wealth differed from other kinds, Sopwith argued, in the extreme uncertainty of its existence and the difficulty of its discovery, which meant that prospecting for a mineral was no different from hoping to win the lottery. Next, with the introduction of systematically arranged mineral statistics, however, mining would become a different kind of endeavor. Instead of counting on chance, entrepreneurs could now depend on data to make intelligent choices, even in a global economy that regularly experiences unpredictable price fluctuations. In this sense, Sopwith concluded, mineral statistics were more prospective than retrospective. That is, to the extent that they transformed mining from an aimless treasure hunt to a strategic search for subterranean resources, they were of far less importance to the present than to future times. One newspaper article from 1843 went so far as to claim that such knowledge would be of more importance to this country than all the mines of Mexico and Peru. Mineral statistics, in other words, were no less valuable than gold. Yet to reduce the Museum of Economic Geology to a bureaucratic machine whose only function was to supply mineral statistics would be to underestimate the pedagogical role that the building and its ingenious sectional arrangements play. Next. To understand how the galleries of the museum and its mining records office were interdependent enterprises, we need to turn to an activity that made the geological sections that we've already seen possible in the first place: digging. In the 1840s, geologist and future director of the museum, Roderick Murchison, predicted that there might be gold in Australia after comparing rock samples from the easternmost regions of the continent to those from the auriferous tracts in the Ural Mountains. This was even before Edward Hargreaves discovered the precious metal in New South Wales in 1851, the same year that the museum opened its doors in its new location. Next. Displays of gold were already prominent in the museum. Cases in the main galleries on the first floor held gold-bearing quartz from California and beryl quartz from Nova Scotia, in addition to specimens from Russia, Hungary, Transylvania, and even from the significantly more modest British sources in Cornwall and Scotland. By the 1860s, gold from Australia would receive its own case along the western side of the galleries, and the model of a mine in Victoria would be added to central cases. Next. Shortly after its reopening, the museum also launched at least 2 public lecture series on the topic of gold, delivered in the auditorium on the ground floor to working men, the museum's presumed audience, for modestly priced tickets. These lectures were intended primarily for the instruction of immigrants about to proceed to Australia. The first of the series, consisting of 6 lectures, took place in 1852. Focusing on topics ranging from geology of Australia to the chemical properties and metallurgical treatment of gold, these lectures attracted so much attention that summaries of their content were published in the popular press. While the lectures delved into a great detail about geology and the colony, their advice, they stressed, was not limited to discovering gold in Australia. J.B. Jukes, local director of the Geological Survey of Ireland, for example, concluded his lecture on the geology of Australia by reminding his audience that gold digging was backbreaking work that did not always prove lucrative. Next. Still, he hoped that his lecture offered more than know-how about gold. He told them that the more important lesson to be learned was an attitude that he claimed was embodied in the very act of digging. The next slide is the quote from Jukes, which I think might be worth reading. So he said, "You go out to dig for gold. Do not be ashamed to dig for anything else. Recollect that it's the avowed object of your voyage and the only thing you have to trust to. If you fail to dig up gold, there are lands to be plowed, sheep to be herded and sheared, cattle to be tended, corn to be sown and reaped. Every one of these fully honorable occupations as digging for gold. Go then with a bold and resolute heart, determined to get your own living by the strength of your own arms and the sweat of your own brows. And be assured that industry and perseverance lead to fortune in Australia with fewer impediments and uncertainties in the way than in any part of the world." Next. I want to stress here that digging here is not simply digging for gold. It's the foremost colonial technique that makes all other colonial enterprises possible, from farming to mining, from settling to husbandry. The goal of these lectures, then, was not only to convey information about where and how gold might be found, but rather instill in the prospecting colonialist a new sensibility. In the 1880s, when British economists started using the term Homo economicus to describe the sensibility, they turned to an essay published by the philosopher John Stuart Mill in 1836, an essay in which Mill described the subject of political economy as a being who desired of judging the comparative efficacy of means for obtaining that end. The assumption that human individuals were endowed with an innate calculative instinct to seek and achieve wealth was absurd, Mill conceded, but necessary if political economy were to proceed as a science. Furthermore, he argued elsewhere, the futurity of the laboring classes was at stake in such characterizations of human nature. If some responded to 19th century political debates by advocating for more dependence and protection for the laboring classes, Mill argued for their self-dependence. But this self-dependence was predicated on the individual worker's presumed capabilities as a homo economicus. In 1848, the year of the revolutions, Mill wrote this: the increase of intelligence of education among the working classes must be attended with corresponding growth of a good sense. And this is the result that is important for us, so that the population will bear a gradually diminishing ratio to capital and employment. Even in their struggles for a social change, in other words, political economic thinking imagine laboring classes to be engaged in the kind of calculative activity ascribed to the Homo economicus. Next. In the sixth and final lecture of the series on the statistics of gold in 1852, Robert Hunt, who was also the keeper of the mining records at the museum, reassured the audience that fears that the influx of Australian gold into European markets would diminish the value of the metal were unfounded. Manner, by making calculations about how much the fortunes of familiar historical figures would be worth in present-day money. By Hunt's reckoning, for example, King Croesus gifted 3 million sterling pounds to the temple in Delphi, and Pericles had 1.162 million sterling pounds, it's very precise, available in the treasury for the defense of Athens. This was all to prove that gold retained its value as a metallic currency, even during dramatic historical upheavals, a conclusion that might have been challenged by theorists of political economy, especially after the introduction of paper money, but nonetheless served the purpose of calming the nerves of a public seeking opportunities in the colonies. Hunt, like Jukes, added, the colonialists might find no modern El Dorado, but legitimate occupations of the artisan and the quiet pursuits of the agriculturalist were also sources of wealth. So if the narrower objective of the Museum of Economic Geology was to offer its mining records office as an information bureau in the service of entrepreneurs in pursuit of new projects, its broader mission was to cultivate the public in the mold of Homo economicus, digging and learning to understand the sections that digging opened up proved to be crucial techniques for the cultivation of the subject. Next. A few years later, when the geologist Warrington Smythe delivered another series of lectures on the topic of gold at the museum, he advised his audience to economize their most important asset, their bodies, the source of their labor. It was essential, he told them, to know exactly how to calculate one's worth. This was Homo economicus taken to its logical extreme, not merely a Lockean possessive individualism that presumed sensations and labor to be one's first property, but one with calculative capabilities that had been sharpened to such an extent that the worker could instinctively infer a favorable ratio between input and labor and output of profit. Since the miner was the best judge of the value of his work, Smythe advised that workers sell their labor through a Dutch auction, a descending price auction that was assumed to benefit the seller. This was where the know-how offered by the Museum of Economic Geology became crucial. And as a final slide, let's return to the museum, to the galleries. Next, please. Not only in the lectures delivered in its auditorium, but also in the exhibits in its galleries and the proto-database in its mining records office. For that ratio between labor and profit to be calculated correctly, both the seller and the buyer had to know about the specificities of geology. So much for recreation and entertainment. Rational recreation and rational entertainment were about working in one's leisure to maximize one's profit. In 1840, speaking to the Geological Society, theologian and geologist William Buckland advocated for the Museum of Economic Geology by arguing that the museum, and especially its mining records office, would facilitate the extraction of the treasures which Providence had laid up in the rich storehouses of the interior of the earth. By this logic, the museum's data collection was the key to this treasure. In the words of Sopwith, its proto-database offered the alphabet by which the hidden and mysterious structure of the earth is unfolded to our view. This was a rationality that was informed by the logic of a new phase of capitalism, in which a human subject would have to be reimagined as a homo economicus, whether that subject was an entrepreneur hoping to make the right decision when investing in a mining enterprise, or a working man whose calculation was simply to make a living. It was this figure that forged the relationship between knowledge and the economy in the 19th century. If we have forgotten this history, it might be because ghosts of that figure continue to haunt us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I hope you heard that.
Yes, we
did. You hear at the end was a bit reverberation.
Fantastic. No, thank you very much for that, Zeynep. And you know, it's really great material, and you've put it together in a really interesting and seductive way, and in a way that I'm sure will mean that we've got lots of questions. I mean, I have the privilege of starting, so I'll just start with a couple of questions. I was fascinated by the relationship between the space of the lecture theatre and the space of the museum, which is above it. And I was wondering both whether the lecture theatre, I mean, obviously lecture theatres are inherently theatrical spaces, but being at the bottom of that kind of well, as it were, in a kind of subterranean way, beneath the actions, whether you know of any instances where the lecturers were using the spectacle above them in a theatrical way within their lecture performances.
I have not come across this. I mean, of course, this building doesn't exist anymore, and whatever remains of it remains, and one has to deal with that. I haven't come any evidence for that, but it's very interesting to think that, I mean, first of all, I hadn't thought that, yes, of course, when you're lecturing, you are in, it's as if you're in a mining shaft, right? You're in a subterranean space. And second, I don't think the glass ceiling of the lecture hall was terribly transparent, but it's very seductive, I'll borrow an adjective from you, to think that somehow the mineral specimens could somehow be glimpsed through the ceiling of the lecture hall, although I have come across no descriptions of that, sadly. Maybe I will still. Great question.
Okay, so my second question is something very different, which is to do with, and this relates to the occasional evidence in the slides you showed of this presence in, for instance, the sectional model of a mine that you briefly showed, and I'd like to know where that can be seen. Is it in Newcastle now?
No, I think now it's all in the collection of the Geological Society, or all of these things. So the problem is all of this stuff, once the museum moved and there was an institutional reshuffling, it just dissipate. I mean, it didn't dissipate. I don't think they're lost, but they, went all over the place. So some of it went to the Natural History Museum collection, some of it went to the Geological Society, some of it went into the Geological Survey. So it what used to be in one building, from what I can tell, split up into a few different collections.
Okay.
But it was manufactured in Newcastle, in his manufactory. And the other thing that is really interesting that this book ends up being about the equipment that goes into buildings for the most part. So cabinets, shelves, and so on are incredibly important in the organization, as in this instance, the cabinets, of course. And Sopwith's manufacturer also designed this desk that was marketed as being like a new invention, a new way of keeping your records in your desk. And it was opened and closed. All the actually, I have a slide of it if you want to see it. But so all the drawers and the cabinets could be locked and unlocked with one key. So he really ventured. So there's some kind of an affinity between the kind of model making and the making of architectural equipment, such as desks or cabinets or drawers and so on, which I find also fascinating.
Okay, so the question that I had was really about labour, about miners. You talked briefly about the way in which miners could be regarded as a kind of, how the resourcing of the mine might work, how you might pay for labour, how the miners themselves might sell their labour. But the question I had was really about information to do with the workings of the mine from the point of view of the miner. So the coal face, the tunnels, the shoring up of the tunnels, the sheer danger, because obviously, right through the 19th century, well into the 20th century, any mine was a place of huge danger. And if you were, you read any local newspaper in the 19th century in a mining region, you become quickly aware of how many mining disasters. So the question is, was that kind of information also found in the museum about the actual kind of labouring within the mine, the tools being used, and the dangers of those spaces?
That's a great question, and one I should incorporate more fully into the chapter. But yes, so the chart that I began with, that Sopwith used, it was published as the address, or the lecture was published as a pamphlet and a subtext, and not even that hidden. A subtext of the address is mining accidents. Of course, this is around the time that new laws were passed for safety, especially underage labor and so on. So that is very much part of the concern, I think, although it doesn't always get to be articulated in the, of course, deeply ideological language of the Museum of Economic Geology, but that is sometimes a subtext and sometimes not even that hidden. So you're absolutely right. That's very important, and I should make that clearer.
Okay. Well, let's open this up for questions, and I think the best way to proceed is if people use the hands up function, and then I'll call upon you, and you can then turn on your mic and your camera, because it's nice to see people actually speaking when they pose their questions and not use the chat function. So if I could ask if anyone has any questions. We've got a lot of people here who I know have great interest in this subject. Do I see any hands up? Am I missing anything? Leslie Top, do you want to come in, Leslie?
Hi there, and thank you for a fascinating paper, for sharing what sounds like really new research with us. That was wonderful. I wanted to pick up actually on Mark's question about the spaces of the museum, and you described the choice of having the galleries in that kind of horseshoe shape as building on the footprint, as it were, of the auditorium below. But I wondered whether you go further with your interpretation of that kind of curve of the galleries and the difference it makes to have galleries arranged like that, as opposed to in a more segmented fashion around a rectilinear floor plan. Was there something there going on about a flow of information or the equivalence of the information across the space?
I think so, because if you are trying to construct a chronological continuity, it really helps to have not a rectangle, but a horseshoe shape, where of course sooner or later it's going to be broken up, because this is not the Guggenheim Museum after all, although it is in some ways like that, right? Although I also want to emphasize, because Sophie Forgan wrote this very nice article about the museum, and it's cited by a lot of scholars. It's not, strictly speaking, a column of strata made horizontal. Actually, the logic of the first floor is very different from the logic of the galleries where the fossils were displayed. But absolutely, in terms of especially in the two galleries where there's a chronological continuity, the curve of the whole, I'm sure, helped with the flow of information for sure.
Just one point, Zeynep. When you look at, so you showed the photograph several times of the view within the museum, that where we get a sense of the lecture theatre below, and we get a sense of the walls. Obviously some of the walls above are actually just panelled, presumably, but some of them have what actually look like blown up versions of the stratigraphic diagrams you showed in your lecture. Are they actually that? So
no, I think it's the cabinets that are arranged that create the illusion that it looks like a section, and the panels are actually doors going to the offices and the leftover spaces leftover from the horseshoe. So the mining records office was in one of those spaces, but also the library and so on. But I mean, that's the wonderful thing about them. They end up looking like a geological section, although they really are not. I don't think they're blown up versions of it. And the other thing that is interesting, I think this is a very small, this was a very, very small building. They must have really pulled some kind of a trick to be able to take that photograph, because I think it would have been really tight to, I did the math, and I think the footprint was less than 500 square meters, the entire building, not the gallery. So it's a tiny little jewel of a building.
This is a museum which presumably is largely funded by what? By the entrepreneurs themselves who become members?
No, by the government. It's done by the Office of Works.
Okay. And presumably, you talked about gold too, and you talked about coal. And I wondered if you had a sense of kind of which were the mineral. Obviously, presumably it was coal that was the crucial mineral.
Yeah.
This is the great period in which, obviously some historians now, coal not as the you know, not as a kind of simply one amongst many of the kind of crucial resources of the industrial revolution, but as the crucial resource.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, I mean it's mostly coal. I mean, when you look at the almanacs from the Mining Records Office, it's mostly coal. Mm-hmm. I mean, the other thing that is so. I mean, this is in a way. This is an early chapter in the book. By the time you get to a slightly later period, and when you get to something like Q herbarium, then a similar. I mean, there's a very similar, you could say, kind of proto-database that is going on, but that's much more thoroughly systematized. I don't think this was as thoroughly systematized as that, and it establishes those global connections much more successfully. I mean, this was kind of I mean, they're not really that good about promoting colonial minerals and so on, and it's kind of a, you know, incomplete effort. It doesn't really become the kind of thing Sopwith imagines it could be. So it's mostly existing, to answer your question, which is coal, of course, rather than new prospects, which would be other metals. Right?
Well, just to see that we've got a question from Ines.
Hi. Sorry?
Question from Ines Weissman. I know.
Oh, hi, Ines.
Hi, Zeynep. I had a hand up earlier.
How are you? I can't see you, but so lovely to hear your voice.
Wait. I can try to put the camera on. Hello, Zeynep.
Hi, nice to see you.
So nice to see you, and also to see some wonderful people in the audience. So thank you for your talk. It was great. And I mean, I've seen a few talks but also I remember the one you gave about 3 years ago, actually in May, at the Courtauld on the Larkin's administration building. And in some ways, I'm really impressed also or kind of always surprised by your choice of case studies of this kind of information architectures that actually bring you into this complex history. So it's sort of as if you read from the building backwards, but in your presentation you present actually the building as the result of let's say that collaboration between the mining industries, the railway construction, and as a kind of a byproduct, we have architects who collaborate actually in creating this architectures that sort of match what you described, these geological sections. So I thought this was a fantastic analogy, and also in a way, let's see, all the case studies that will come, if you already mentioned the Kew Gardens, but next to each other, I think it's already a fantastic methodology in which you work in that sense. Thank you so much for pointing this out, these fantastic case studies. There was one question of Mark already, or comment that took away parts of my question when he was asking actually how these kind of panels or displays were actually used. And I thought it was really fascinating when you said, or actually some of them were just panels and doors to office rooms behind that. But also in the light of your work on kinesthetic knowledge, I believe that this whole machine of the lecture hall, right, that kind of basically has all the maps, I mean, in these display cupboards. But maybe you could expand and kind of also taking this slightly earlier to where you, how you would maybe describe it, this kinesthetic knowledge working in this enormous lecture hall. Or whether you see it there already. Is that something you would place into, let's say, the pedagogical, art school, but maybe it's already here in this kind of geological, you call it entertainment or rationale.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I am so sick of that research. I always think I've turned the page on it, but actually you're absolutely right, because there is I mean, in kinesthetic knowing, I talk at length about this, idea of the object lesson, right? Where you somehow, especially for the minds conceived as being lesser minds of women and children and the working classes and so on, that the object lesson is the appropriate way of educating them, right? And there's a similar kind of thing going on here, right? Both in the lecture hall, which of course Heinrich Böchlin thought of the slide lecture as an object lesson as well, and also in the gallery where the education is carried out through these objects. You're right. I mean, that kind of thing also comes into play, except of course I'm trying so hard to distance myself from that now.
Okay.
That's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Okay, and thanks for that. And we have another question from Alistair Cartwright. Alistair.
Yeah, thank you for that fascinating talk. I was just wondering if you had come across anything or thought about anything to do with how landowners responded to or were involved in this research, this cataloguing and surveying of the land, and just thinking more generally about the roles of surveys in establishing the basis of a more formalized system of private property, and the way that I mean, this thing of what's under the surface being unknown at a certain point, and then it has to be established. And the way that the way that Marx talks about it was that you in order to have differential rent, you have to have inequality between different types of land, which requires some kind of knowledge about what's under there. You have to have a series of qualities of land.
That's such a great question. So the way that the museum publicizes itself is by making the claim that this is just as good as this is just as important for landowners who may be invested in agriculture as a mining entrepreneur. But there's a little bit of anxiety when you scratch that surface, because of course the kind of this kind of laissez-faire economy that is being implicitly promoted here was adamantly being resisted by the agriculture industry at this point, right? So now that you asked the question, it seems to me that one could possibly read that those bits in all the museum's own publicity about how important all of this would be to the landowners as a kind of attempt to calm them down as well, right? And it's almost a veiled threat. It's sometimes takes the form of, if you don't know what's under your land, someone else can come and take your mineral resources without you even knowing. So it becomes a kind of an excuse to continue this line of thinking. So that's very interesting. I'll think more about that. That's a great question.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that. Could we even perhaps think of the idea of the colony in a rather different way in relationship to mining, to coal mining especially? I mean, obviously, the colony has a legal status, but also there are it seems to be so many similarities, but some of which are brought out in that question and the answer you gave to it, between exploitation of colonial possessions and exploitation of the landscape within Britain, that sometimes it's this distinction is not actually quite a very useful one anymore, and we should go beyond it. I am, for instance, often struck by, you presumably seen the diagrams that mining engineers did of the layout of mines beneath the ground, and they look like colonial towns. You know, they're laid out in grid.
I have an image actually at the end of my PowerPoint. Yeah, they do.
Yeah, and so if the subterranean surface is regarded as a resource, and that resource is something, as you've just said, that the landowner themselves needs to make a conscious claim upon, the landowner themselves is not unlike the indigenous landowner or land dweller in the formal colonial context. And of course, then there are all the kind of the human resources of the miners themselves, which can be, you know, kind of exploited, put into dangerous situations. You know, they become another resource that the entrepreneur, who is the privileged, I guess, the privileged figure of the museum, the entrepreneur and the geologist. I'm just thinking of how we can perhaps play a little bit more with the idea of the colony in the mining context.
That is, am I understanding you correctly? Are you saying that in a way the section itself becomes a colony of sorts? Is that what you're getting at? Yes,
the as it were, the undiscovered. We could call it.
Yeah.
That the land beneath the surface is the land, is the kind of, you know, the land which is only just beginning to gain its kind of identity because it's being mapped by geologists.
That is fascinating. Well, I recently read in this very nice book by Borak about coal. He talks about the Ottoman Empire, and he says when, you know, by the 19th century, it became hard for the Ottoman Empire to conquer any more land. They decided to go vertical. So instead of, you know, horizontal conquering, you conquer the vertical. So it's very tempting. I hadn't thought about that in that way, but in a way it does. I mean, then what's interesting is that it's almost like a way to legally bypass the current arrangement, which, you know, if you're a landowner, you own the top of the soil, and then this becomes a place to colonize, right? So it could actually, it's another way about thinking about colonization. You're absolutely right. That's very suggestive. I'll have to think more about that, but it's a very, very suggestive thought.
Okay, have we got any questions? Anyone waiting? I'm having to scroll up and down to see if there are any hands up. I obviously missed the last hands up. Anyone with a question or a comment? I don't want to dominate. I mean, I could continue talking to you, but I want to.
I would love to hear you continue talking. You are full of brilliant ideas.
I mean, the question of how those upper galleries were actually used and access to them, who would have access to them? Are they regarded as, I mean, in a little way, I mean, obviously a comparable space in some regard is the old British Library, and where the upper galleries would only have been accessible to the librarians. So, I mean, who had access to those upper galleries in the museum?
I think the public had access to the upper galleries. Where they didn't have access was into the mining records and the library. And so in that ground floor plan, there's a hole of British marbles. Beyond that, there's a model room, and then it increasingly becomes more private. Mm-hmm. But I think the galleries, I am pretty sure that, you know, the visiting public could go up with the spiral cases at the end of the galleries.
So you would imagine them pulling out draws in order to inspect specimens? Is that the kind of activity that a visitor might engage in? Is it?
I don't think, from what I can tell, there was nothing to be touched really in the galleries, the main galleries, and those models that I showed, the geological models, they always go with a little bit of warning. If you want to see the section, tell someone at the museum. So I don't think anybody was allowed to actually open things up and, you know, look at the sections themselves. So it was a very much do not touch kind of arrangement.
Okay. We do have one question. It's Alistair again. Alistair, come in.
Yeah, sorry to hog the questions, but I was just wondering if what this research has made you think about contemporary databases, like how this kind of database. I know it's the big question, but yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything profound to say except this. I think to understand data or databases as something that has inevitably happened as a technological inevitability because of computational techniques and so on is just not right. I think these arrangements, these epistemic arrangements, come about because of political necessity, not because of technological inevitability. And furthermore, I suspect, and this is why I decided to ultimately throw out, you know, Ines mentioned the Larkin Administration Building. I mean, that was part of this project at some point, and then I threw out the American example, and there was a French example, precisely because I wanted to link it to capitalism, to be perfectly honest, much more clearly. And it seems to me that when laissez-faire policies are implemented, when the world is supposed to be this place where things move in a frictionless way, that it becomes ever more important to create these arrangements where things are very tightly controlled. So I would argue that our current arrangement also has something to do with the political situation we're in, and less with the technological situation we're in. So that's the bigger claim, I guess. But I don't have anything profound to say about databases per se.
No, thank you. That's already enough. Food for thought, really. Yeah.
And you mentioned the coal exchange as well, the building of the coal exchange, and I wondered. I mean, obviously that had primarily, and but not exclusively, primarily a dealing function in coal. And I wondered really what was the nature of the relationship between the two buildings. I mean, were there actually people who would use both buildings, or were these entirely separate groups? I mean, how in a sense did information travel between the two buildings, if at all?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't know the answer to that, but it reminds me, the relationship reminds me of the, and I need to look into that. That's not, I really need to do that research, but it reminds me of the relationship that Ted Porter, whose work I admire very much, has set up between experts and say speculative things like don't know, stock brokers and so on. So the expertise of the museum would be what Ted Porter would call a technology of trust that would sustain the kind of dealing that would go on in the coal exchange. Because when you look at the coal exchange, it's all, you know, all those offices around it, it's all offices for the dealers. But for an enterprise like the stock, for the coal exchange to exist, and because these are all very fragile and potentially unstable speculative enterprises, right? They need a technology of trust to sustain them. And it seems to me that the kind of expertise that the Museum of Economic Geology provided was precisely that. Same with Q, you could say. I mean, these databases could be thought of in that sense as technologies of trust.
I wonder whether there's something to be said about a kind of comparison with something like cotton here. I mean, cotton in Manchester, which is I know a bit about, but of course you have a major exchange, which is the Cotton Exchange, the Royal Exchange in Manchester, you know, which has all the dealing functions in cotton that presumably the Coal Exchange had in London for coal. And I know from the membership of the Royal Exchange in Manchester that there weren't just dealers who were members there. There were manufacturers, there were engineers, there were machine makers, there were a whole range of people who had different kind of expertise and different interests in the cotton industry going to the exchange building, and not necessarily just to deal. Unlike London, though, there was nothing like a museum like this. There was no cotton museum. So in a sense, there was no database in the form of a museum on cotton. Or if there was, it was much more dispersed. Maybe we could find the equivalent of a museum for cotton, not in a museum building because there wasn't one, but instead in places like warehouses and the town hall, you know, in a whole range of other buildings which were quite close to the exchange building. So, I mean, what I'm thinking is, you know, perhaps in a sense, the museum, a museum like this one of economic geology, I think that term economic is interesting there, not just geology, but how the geology can be, as it were, used for the purposes of capital. You know, that concretizes a process and a system of exchange and information that elsewhere might not need a museum to function.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's very interesting. I mean, but I suspect they also use the services of the Kew Herbarium, because when I do the research on the Kew Herbarium, this is exactly the kind of thing that you come across, all these requests about, I mean, the famous example is during the American Civil War, where you can't get cotton, where do you transplant cotton so that you can, I mean, this is the kind of expertise that Kew provided, right? The Kew Herbarium. And I find it interesting that it was done in a super ad hoc manner. And it took me a while to wrap my head around it, because I traced the case of Cinchona, which was actually a government project. But for the most part, most of what Kew did, the Kew Herbarium, the botanist there did, was to respond to random requests from this private entrepreneur and that, and I imagine also the Manchester Cotton Exchange. So, but of course that's not next to, so that kind of knowledge, you're right, was in many cases distributed, even when it was centralized, as in the case of Kew. It was still carried out not through set protocols, but in a very ad hoc manner that I think has something to do with, and you would, Mark, know much more about this than I possibly could, but debates about constructive imperialism and to what extent you actually involve the government in these, economic endeavors. You know, so it probably has something, but it's interesting that it's so ad hoc. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Any more questions? I mean, time is moving on. I think we should probably bring this to a stop. Thank you very much, Zeynep. I'd love to be able to say, come out for dinner now, which is what we would normally do in the kind of pre-COVID circumstances. But I hope you will, if and when you're in London next, I hope you'll give us a chance to take you out and discuss this more. And
I would love to do that. And not only that, I mean, I'm actually going to try to come this summer if I can get a visa, but I will certainly let you know. And your questions were absolutely fantastic. So thank you. This was wonderful. I hope we keep in touch.
Yes, definitely. And thank you for everyone